What if the blood of kings did not produce heirs of glory, but children born already marked by the sins of their dynasty? The night she entered this world, the palace was silent, broken only by the sound of a newborn's cry. It was sharp, thin, almost unnatural. In a cradle of gold, lit by the flicker of candles, lay an infant girl. Her back was already bent, her body twisted by something no nurse could straighten. The whispers began before the echo of her first breath had faded. Another Habsburg child, a courtier murmured, another broken branch of the family tree. The servant who carried her through the marble halls remembered how the courtiers lowered their eyes, how the sound of that cry seemed to stain the air. From the very beginning, she was not seen as a blessing, but as a warning, a living scar of a dynasty that married its own too often, believing crowns could erase the cost of blood. And so we must ask, what happens when the crown itself breeds monsters within its blood? What future awaits a girl who is dressed in silk to hide a crooked spine, who is taught to smile while the court sneers behind her back? The curtain of red velvet was drawn over her cradle that night, as if the royal family could hide her from history. But no curtain could silence destiny. This was the story of Margaret, the hunchback princess who became a queen, a woman whose very body carried the burden of a cursed bloodline. Stay with us, for her life is not only a tale of deformity and shame, but of unexpected power and haunting legacy. And if you want to uncover more rulers whose flesh bore the sins of their crowns, make sure you subscribe so you will not miss the truths that history tried to hide. The child who had been born into gold grew up surrounded not by affection, but by stares that burned more than fire. Margaret's earliest memories were not of lullabies or games, but of the way silence spread whenever she entered a hall, of the eyes that quickly lowered, too polite to mock her openly, too cruel to offer kindness. Every morning began with the same ritual. In a chamber that smelled of wax and damp stone, little Margaret stood before a mirror so tall it seemed to mock her small frame. At her side was Mencia de Mendoza, the woman appointed to guard her appearance as carefully as any royal decree. The corset lay across the bed, its laces dangling like ropes waiting to bind a prisoner. "Hold still, child," Mencia would whisper. Then her fingers pulled, harder and harder, until Margaret's waist bent into shapes no body should endure. The girl clenched her teeth until her lips bled. She never cried aloud, never gave them that satisfaction. Only in the silence of the night did the pillows reveal her grief, dampened by tears she would never admit to shedding. She was the bravest creature I ever saw, Mencia later confessed, but she was only a child. I feared the corset would break her bones before the world broke her heart. Yet the world did both. At court, Margaret excelled in her lessons. She absorbed languages with an ease that impressed her tutors, played the lute with delicate precision, and wrote poetry so sharp it startled those who expected nothing from her. But brilliance could not erase her shadowed form. Children of noble blood whispered behind her back. The crooked princess. Servants bowed as required, but some crossed themselves when she passed. As though her body carried a curse, Margaret understood far more than they believed. One evening, as Mencia brushed out her long hair by the fire, Margaret spoke in a voice too steady for a child. "If they laugh at me, let them. Their laughter will die. Mine must not." Mencia froze. The brush caught in a tangle. "You are too young to speak so." "I am not young," Margaret replied, her eyes fixed on the flames. I was born old. My back told me so. It was a moment Mencia never forgot. A girl no older than 10, already bearing herself like a woman who had read her fate and accepted it. Yet even that strength could not silence the ache of isolation. Margaret's games were not with other children, but with books and canvases. She painted landscapes she would never walk, and wrote verses about freedom she would never taste. From the shadows of her chambers, she listened to laughter from the courtyards, knowing she was not welcome there. One winter night, the palace echoed with music from a ball she was not invited to attend. Margaret stood at her window, her crooked silhouette framed by moonlight, watching the torches flicker in the distance. Mencia found her there, silent, her small hands gripping the stone ledge so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "They will not see me," Margaret said softly, "because I remind them of what they wish to forget. Their blood is not perfect. Their crowns are not clean." Mencia could find no words. She placed a cloak around the girl's shoulders, but no fabric could warm her against the cold truth. From the beginning, Margaret's life was not her own. She was a child of royal blood, yet her body was treated as a flaw, a wound wrapped in silk. And though she had learned to walk with her head high, even as her back bent under invisible weight, she carried inside her a truth sharper than any crown. She was not the future they dreamed of. She was the reminder of a dynasty's sins, breathing, watching, waiting. The decree fell like a shadow across the court. Margaret was to marry her cousin. No one spoke of love. They spoke of duty, of alliances, of keeping the Habsburg circle unbroken. By dusk, the words ran through the palace with cruel clarity. The hunchback will wed the cripple. In her chamber, candles trembled against polished glass. The bridal gown lay ready, white silk heavy with golden thread, yet no light could disguise the curve of her back. Margaret stood before the mirror, her fingers grazing the ridge beneath her shoulder blades, as if to confirm what could never be erased. Mencia de Mendoza entered with the corset in her arms. For years she had bound the child into impossible shapes, but tonight her hands hesitated. She set the garment down and studied her mistress in silence. The girl had grown into a woman, but the weight on her shoulders was the same. Margaret's voice was low, steady, almost detached. "They dress me in gold, but send me to breed ghosts." The words stung sharper than any sob. Mencia lowered her eyes, unable to answer. Outside, the palace thrummed with celebration. Bells were prepared to toll, choirs to sing, courtiers to bow. Yet in this room, only the hiss of candle wax broke the silence. Margaret moved to the window. Below, torches lit the courtyards, a festival of fire marking her destiny. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, pale and solemn. For a long while she did not speak. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "If I am to be a wife, I will not be an innocent." Mencia understood. Truth, however cruel, was all that remained. The night stretched long. Margaret refused the gown, refused the veil, sat motionless at her table, her hands folded before the candle. She had endured a lifetime of whispers, but never had they been so loud. The hunchback will wed the cripple. Tonight those words wrapped tighter than any corset. When the knock came, it was discreet, but final. The door opened to reveal the physician, summoned not to heal, but to confirm what the dynasty already feared. His leather case swung at his side, his face half in shadow. Margaret rose. She did not touch the silk waiting on her bed. She did not touch the veil of lace. She simply said, with a voice stripped bare of illusion, "Close the door and speak only truth." The chamber was lit by only 3 candles when Francisco López de Villalobos entered. He was not just another court physician. His reputation as a scholar of medicine and natural philosophy had carried from Spain to the halls of the Habsburgs. His presence meant the matter was grave, though no proclamation said so aloud. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, her veil discarded, her gown untouched. Behind her stood Mencía de Mendoza, silent as stone. Villalobos bowed, then opened a leather folio filled with notes, sketches of bones, and the branching diagrams of family trees. He spoke with the measured tone of a man who preferred parchment to whispers. "I have been asked to consider what such unions may yield," he said carefully. "You know your family's history as well as I. Cousins wed cousins, uncles wed nieces. The blood of emperors grows concentrated, but also fragile." Margaret's hands tightened in her lap. Fragile. Villalobos nodded, his eyes avoiding the curve of her back. "In Spain, I have seen children of noble houses born with jaws that cannot close, with limbs that fail before manhood. The tree of blood, when forced too close upon itself, produces branches that struggle to bear fruit." He laid one of his sketches on the table. It showed 2 branches twisted around one another, sprouting leaves already withered. His hand hovered over it, but did not touch. "It is not certainty, my lady. It is tendency. Nature resists what men impose upon it." Margaret stared at the drawing. The inked lines seemed to mock her, as if her very body had been pulled from those pages. Her voice was barely a whisper. "So the womb may carry not heirs, but curses." Villalobos inclined his head, but offered no affirmation. His role was to present observations, not to condemn. Still, his silence weighed more heavily than words. Mencía knelt beside her mistress, clutching her hand. Margaret's face was composed, but her eyes reflected a storm. "Then I am not meant to be a bride," she murmured, "but a vessel of their gamble." Villalobos closed his folio, the pages snapping shut like a verdict. "My lady," he said softly, "history will not remember what we speak here. It will remember only what the crown commands. But I beg you, guard your strength. For a body may bend, yet a spirit can still rule." He bowed again, then departed, his shadow retreating with the candlelight. Margaret remained, staring at the sketch he had left behind. 2 crooked branches twisting into one another, their leaves curled and dark. In that image, she saw her fate more clearly than any sermon could deliver. The bells of the palace rehearsed for her wedding, but in her heart, the ceremony had already become a funeral march. The Cathedral of Burgos glowed with torches, its vaulted ceilings echoing with organ music as Margaret of Austria walked down the aisle. Her gown was a river of silk and gold, every stitch meant to blind the eye to what no fabric could hide. The curve of her back pulled her shoulders forward, and though her chin was high, she felt the weight of every gaze. At the altar stood John of Castile, only 19, yet already frail, his complexion pale, his jaw heavy in the unmistakable mark of his dynasty. His shoulders sloped, his figure narrow, and when he turned, Margaret saw a nervous flicker in his eyes. He looked less like a prince prepared to rule, and more like a youth dragged into a destiny he could not refuse. The vows were spoken in Latin, their voices echoing. Margaret's words were steady, though her throat tightened with each syllable. John's trembled, the sound breaking once before he forced it forward. The ring was cold as it slid onto her finger, the applause that followed colder still. At the feast, Margaret sat beside him, the hall roaring with laughter and music. Courtiers raised goblets, whispered, and stole glances at the pair. Margaret lowered her eyes to her plate, appetite gone, corset biting into her ribs. She risked a glance at her husband. His hand shook as he lifted his cup, his jaw tense as he forced himself to chew a morsel of bread. He did not look at her. She did not speak. Between them stretched a silence more eloquent than words. When at last the feasting ended, they were led to their chamber. The door closed, and the roar of the hall faded into silence. The room was thick with candlelight, the bed prepared with ceremonial precision. Margaret stood near the window, her hands gripping the sill, her breath shallow. She could hear John's movements behind her, soft, uncertain. Minutes passed. Neither spoke. The expectation in the air pressed heavier than the gowns, heavier than the crowns. Margaret's heart pounded, but she kept her face turned to the glass, watching her faint reflection tremble. At last, John's voice broke the silence, low and strained. They expect much of us. Margaret turned slowly, startled not by the words but by the honesty in them. His eyes met hers for a brief moment before sliding away. There was no mockery, no cruelty, only unease. She answered quietly, almost against her will, "And they give us little." The silence returned, but something in it had shifted, not tenderness, not yet trust, but a fragile acknowledgement that both were prisoners of the same design. Outside, Mencia de Mendoza stood vigil, her ear close to the heavy wood. She heard no weeping, no laughter, only two voices, brief and hesitant, threading through the silence. She whispered to herself, "Perhaps she is not alone tonight." Margaret lay awake long after the candles burned low. Her husband slept uneasily, his breath shallow, his jaw clenched even in dreams. She watched him and felt not love, not comfort, but the faintest easing of the loneliness that had shadowed her since childhood. For now, it was enough. For the first months of her marriage, Margaret discovered that her new life was not a prison of solitude. John of Castile, frail in body yet sharp in mind, carried the same burden she bore. His jaw bore the Habsburg weight, hers the twisted spine, and both knew what the courtiers whispered when they turned away. Yet behind closed doors, they spoke openly of the fate their families had sealed for them. At night, when the feasts were done and the chamber emptied of servants, they shared the truths others avoided. John confessed how his tutors reminded him daily that his duty was to beget heirs, even as his health failed him. Margaret admitted the words of Francisco López de Villalobos still echoed in her ears, the image of branches twisted upon themselves haunting her thoughts. "We are their gamble," John said once, his voice hoarse. "They know the risk, yet they throw the dice again." Margaret studied his face in the candlelight. She saw the heaviness of his jaw, the tension it placed on his speech, and in that moment she felt no shame for her own body. "Then let us be more than dice," she answered. Their bond was not woven with romance, but with defiance. Together they sought ways to resist the weight of expectation. John encouraged Margaret to continue her studies, to write letters in her flawless Latin and French, to sharpen her mind beyond what was asked of her. She, in turn, steadied him when weakness overtook his limbs, guiding him through gardens when courtiers expected him to be hidden. Mencia de Mendoza recalled finding them late one evening bent over a single book. They read not as husband and wife, she whispered later, but as allies plotting their survival. The court did not understand. To them, John was failing to produce an heir, and Margaret was the crooked bride who could not save him. But within their chambers, a different truth lived. They spoke of children not as dynastic pawns, but as lives too fragile to risk. They dared to imagine a future where duty did not demand their bodies be sacrificed for a throne. Yet such hope could not last. John's health declined with each season. His frailty grew visible, his steps shorter, his cough harsher. Margaret stood by him through it all, not as a grieving wife clinging to love, but as the only soul who knew his struggle mirrored her own. When he collapsed on the hunting field, Margaret's fear was not only for his life, but for the fragile alliance they had built against the crown's designs. She sat by his bed as he drifted in and out of fever, their whispered plans dissolving into silence. Days later, when the bells tolled, Margaret understood that their rebellion had died with him. At the funeral, she walked in black, her face unreadable, her back bent yet her head unbowed. The whispers returned, sharp as knives. No heir, no future, but inside her. Margaret carried the memory of nights where two broken heirs dared to stand against the dynasty that had forged them. She had learned one truth from John's short life. Resistance could be quiet, unseen, yet still powerful. And though she stood alone now, she would not forget. The years after John's death hardened Margaret, but they also forged her into something unexpected. No longer bride, no longer pawn. She became the woman the Habsburg Dynasty had not foreseen. Widowhood at 19 might have left her cast aside, but destiny called her back when her nephew, Charles, rose to the imperial throne. The Low Countries needed a regent, and Margaret was chosen. The court murmured when she took her place in Mechelen. A woman, bent of back, marked since birth, standing before dukes and counts as if she belonged among them. Some whispered she was unfit, that her crooked form was a sign of God's displeasure. Yet when Margaret spoke, their doubts faltered. Her voice carried not beauty, but command. She switched easily between tongues, answering in French, Flemish, or Spanish, her words as sharp as steel. Mencia de Mendoza, now gray and aged, still at her side, recalled the first assembly. They looked at her body, she said, but they heard her will, and in that moment, she ruled straighter than any man among them. Margaret's regency became a paradox that confounded her enemies. The same dynasty that had once hidden her under velvet curtains now relied on her to keep its fragile empire intact. She negotiated treaties, arranged marriages, and steered the Netherlands through unrest. She never remarried, never bore children, but in council chambers and in state affairs, her authority was unchallenged. And yet, behind the walls of her palace, she remained a woman haunted. In her private chambers, she kept a few relics of John letters, a book of poetry, a ring that had slipped once upon her finger, not as tokens of romance, but reminders of the only person who had truly shared her struggle. She wore black often, a widow's color, but also a shield, a constant mark of defiance against the destiny that had sought to use her body as a vessel and nothing more. As the years passed, her back bent further, the crooked line deepening with age. Still, she carried herself with dignity, moving slowly yet firmly through the corridors of power. Servants whispered that she seemed carved of iron, her fragility only an illusion. When the end came in 1530, she was surrounded not by children or heirs, but by the relics of power she had wielded. A crown rested near her bed, more symbol than possession. Mencia, trembling with age, wiped dust from the golden circlet and placed it on a cushion beside her mistress. They called her crooked, the old maid whispered, yet she ruled straighter than all of them. The chamber was quiet, except for the flicker of candles. Margaret lay still, her bent form a silhouette beneath the sheets. The crown on its cushion seemed almost drawn toward her, as if history itself demanded it rest upon the back it once shamed. And so her story closed, not as tragedy alone, but as symbol. She was the child once hidden behind red curtains, the bride who knew her womb might carry curses, the widow who found strength in loss, and the regent who bent but did not break. If a monstrous body could bear a crown, was it truly the body that was cursed, or the dynasty that forged it? Stay with us as we continue to uncover the rulers whose flesh bore the sins of their crowns. Subscribe now, and do not look away from the truths history tried to hide.